How does a group in power, well, stay in power? It's not always about brute force. A lot of the time, it's about an idea. It's a quiet, powerful story that gets told over and over, one that defines who's normal and who is, well, not. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a huge theory that explains exactly how this works, the relationship between what we call the subject and the other. And it all kicks off with this single, absolutely explosive sentence. It's from Simone de Beauvoir's 1949 masterpiece, The Second Sex. This one line, it threw a wrench into centuries of thinking about gender, about power. But what does it actually mean? What does it mean to be called the other? Okay, so to really get that quote, we have to understand a core idea. De Beauvoir says that as humans, we kind of think in pairs. There's the self, right? And then there's everything that is not the self. But here's the twist. This isn't just a neutral observation. No, this is the very foundation that identity and power are built on. So the other isn't just someone who's different from you. It's a category, a box that's actually created by a dominant group, what de Beauvoir calls the subject. This group sets itself up as the default, the standard model for what a human being is. And by doing that, they automatically make the other group seem secondary, defined only by how they relate back to the main group. And this creates this totally lopsided relationship. Just look at this. The subject is seen as the absolute, the essential, the norm. They're not just positive, they're neutral, they're the default. Meanwhile, the other gets defined as everything they're not, the relative, the inessential, the deviation. They basically become a dumping ground for all the negative traits. It is a profoundly unequal game. All right, so that's the theory. But how does this abstract stuff actually play out in the real world? Well, de Beauvoir was the first person to really take this framework and apply it step by step to the history and social situation of women. And for her, this idea was the key that unlocked the entire puzzle of patriarchy. She kicks the whole thing off with this question that sounds so simple, but it's not. What is a woman? For de Beauvoir, the fact that you even have to ask this question says everything. She famously pointed out that a man would never, ever write a book about the peculiar situation of the human male. Why not? Because it's just assumed that he is the default human. His situation isn't peculiar, it's just normal. Her conclusion was pretty stark. She said that throughout history, humanity has basically been defined as male. Man is the essential one. Women, on the other hand, isn't seen as her own person, an autonomous subject. No, she is defined by her relationship to him. She becomes the incidental, the inessential, the other. But that raises a huge question. Why has this been so incredibly stable for centuries? De Beauvoir gives a really fascinating answer. Unlike other marginalized groups, women aren't a minority. They don't have their own separate history or culture that could unite them. Instead, they're spread out, living side by side with the very men who make up the dominant group. And that makes organizing any kind of unified challenge incredibly difficult. Okay, now let's fast forward a few decades. The thinker Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak picks up this powerful idea, and she expands it. She takes it beyond just gender and applies it to the massive global legacy of colonialism. And just like de Beauvoir, Spivak poses a question that will echo for decades. Can the subaltern speak? But this time, she's asking about the people silenced not just by patriarchy, but by empire. So, who or what is the subaltern? The subaltern are the people on the absolute lowest rungs of society, completely cut off from any line to power. In the context of a colony, this meant the huge populations who weren't even part of the conversation. Their voices, their experiences, their entire way of seeing the world was just erased from the official story. Spivak says that imperialism wasn't just about military force and economic control. It was also a kind of epistemic violence. Now that's a heavy term, but the idea is chillingly simple. It's the violence of rewriting knowledge itself. It's when the colonizer comes in and effectively says, your history, your culture, your gods, none of it counts. Our way of knowing is the only way that matters. And that is how you turn a whole population into the other. So you see the exact same pattern, right? Just like man defines himself as the subject against woman as the other, Spivak showed how the colonizing West built its own identity as modern and rational by defining the colonized people as its opposite, as primitive, irrational, and other. So here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when these two powerful theories, these two massive structures of power, actually intersect? What happens when a person gets caught in that crossfire? First, you've got the structure of patriarchy that de Beauvoir laid out, which casts woman as the other in relation to man. And then you have the structure of imperialism that Spivak identified, which casts the native person as the other in relation to the Western colonizer. So what happens to the person who exists at the intersection of both of those? What about the woman who is also a colonial subject? Spivak's answer here is just devastating. The subaltern woman, she says, is doubly silenced. Think about it. She's pushed to the margins by patriarchy within her own culture, and then her entire culture is pushed to the margins by the violence of colonialism. Her voice is the most suppressed, her story the most erased. She is, as Spivak says, even more deeply in shadow. So why does all of this, theory from decades ago still matter so much today? Because this framework, this way of understanding power, it didn't just go away. Not at all. It actually gives us an incredibly sharp lens to see our own world more clearly. We've seen how this one powerful idea grew. It started as a theory of gender with de Beauvoir. Then it became a theory of empire with Spivak. And when you put them together, you get something even bigger, a theory of power itself. It teaches us to always ask the question, who's being set up as the default subject, and who is being defined against them as the other? And this really brings us to the final crucial takeaway. This whole dynamic of creating an other to feel secure in yourself is a fundamental pattern of how social power works. So look around you, in politics, in the media, in our own communities. Who is being presented as the default, the norm, and who is being defined as the other? The answer to that question tells you an awful lot about where power really lies.